story is true.
The 1980s was a decade worthy of its name. It stood for a span of time with a unifying, coherent philosophy, which we all more or less shared. In the 80s, it was morning in America.
Greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works.
And morning in America sounded good, but proved to be a false dawn, fueled by junk bonds and government debt. And when the market crashed, the junk dealers on Wall Street began to look a lot like the crack entrepreneurs, devastating the inner cities. The 1980s represented a huge U-turn for a lot of people, and a descent into a crack cocaine-induced nightmare from which many will never awake. Something happened in America in the 1980s, something not yet fully understood, but seen in outline by almost everyone. The growth of a multi-billion-dollar drug trade with the power to create narco-democracies everywhere its tentacles spread. And they spread a lot of places, even here. In the land where the palm trees kiss the tangerine sunsets 365 days in a row, Los Angeles, California. So we begin our story of the drugging of America here in Los Angeles. Hello, and welcome to Conspiracy, The Secret History. My name is Daniel Hopsicker, and I'll be your guide tonight on our journey to the secret heartbeat of America. We're in Los Angeles because what happened in Los Angeles happened in hundreds of other American cities in the 80s. But because it's Los Angeles, it happened bigger. Everything is bigger here. The money, the cars, the houses, the drugs, especially the drugs. Until recently, Los Angeles looked to many observers like the capital of the future. Then drugs began to destroy whatever social stability existed here. Admittedly, never much. This is a company town, a factory town, the manufacturing home of America's second leading export, the moving word, movies. Then crack came to town and everything changed. The results are everywhere around us. Every one of these faces is an MIA in the longest and most costly war this country has ever fought. A war that's already lasted twice as long as Vietnam. A war that cost us way over $16 billion a year, even though nobody thinks we've got a prayer of winning it. Of course, the name of this war is as familiar to every American as the names of our family, friends, and neighbors that have been lost in it. It's called the war on drugs. Tonight we're going to see evidence that it just might be an utter sham. Since crack came to town in the middle 80s, there have been persistent reports that the Contras and the CIA were somehow involved in it. So we begin our story about drugs in the American way in an unlikely place, here in San Jose, California, with the controversial series Dark Alliance, the story behind the crack explosion in the San Jose Mercury News, written by Gary Webb. His series linked the explosive growth in the market for crack cocaine to the shadowy funding of the Contras back in the middle 80s. Remember? Iran-Contra, selling guns to the Ayatollah?
Incentives to make that February transaction work. And the attractive incentive for me was the one he made, that residuals could flow to support the Nicaraguan resistance.
That was the Iran part of the Iran-Contra equation. Many people felt it scandalous to be selling weapons to people who were directly responsible for the deaths of 251 of our fellow countrymen in Lebanon. A few even called it treasonous. Webb's story raised the frightening picture of out-of-control elements of our nation's covert intelligence agencies peddling drugs like an army of Ivy League superflies. In places like Los Angeles, the effects are still being felt.
And it's on these city streets that the drugs, the crack, ended up. The gangs in Los Angeles distributed crack cocaine to over 110 American cities that had never seen or heard of the drug before. And today, 10 years after the Nicaraguan Contra War is over, the crack is still here.
Today, cynicism over this fact in the African American community is, to say the least, widespread.
To be black in America, we the janitors. So black folks grow up knowing stuff. And so we've been knowing this. I mean, we say it in our nice little way where we say we don't have planes. We can't laundry money. You know, it's hard for a black person to get a check cashed in their own bank. And so how we going to laundry drug money? And so what's amazing to us and what makes us feel good is white America now is beginning to see what we've been knowing all along.
I was catapulted into this issue because of my shock and outrage at the idea that government could have anyway been involved with the trafficking of drugs in this country. I think it is one of the most outrageous kinds of undermining of the citizens of this country that could have ever occurred.
So tonight, we're asking questions about the almost taboo subject of the drugging of America. Who profits? Who's responsible? Who benefits? Follow the money went the refrain during Watergate. Tonight, that's what we're going to do.
Drugs are an audible pulse, throbbing right beneath the surface of the soundtrack of our life and times. The business is so big you can even hear it if you listen closely enough.
Into the distance, a ribbon of black, stretched to the point of no turning back.
Tonight, we're going to tell you a story about the big bull elephant called the drug trade that squatted hard on certain parts of our country during the 1980s. You'll see what happened to people who were ordinary citizens until the whirlwind of drug trafficking scooped down and devoured everything in its path. Like Linda Ives, whose son Kevin was brutally murdered and then left to be dismembered by a speeding death train on a sultry August night in the Arkansas of 1987. The boys' murders have come to be called the train deaths. Near these tracks, 2 young high school boys were murdered after witnessing a drug drop, which, if you're not up on the lingo, is basically a place where on regular runs a plane flies over a designated spot like on these tracks, and drugs and sometimes money are parachuted down. The murder has become the most famous unsolved mystery in the country, but most of the mystery has gone out of it for a crusading mother who lost a child.
If you'd lived through what I've lived through, you would know that U.S. drug policy is not just say no, it's just fly low.
And there's this woman, Jean Duffy, a no-nonsense Arkansas prosecuting attorney who headed up a federally funded drug task force, getting a little too close to solving the boys' murders till she was run out of state in fear for her life.
My opinion has been involved is a CIA, perhaps a CIA rogue operation conducted by CIA operatives to smuggle drugs into the United States from South America, specifically using Barry Seal's drug smuggling operation in Mena.
And this man, Adler Berryman Seal, the most successful drug smuggler in American history. He was the most famous cocaine buccaneer in an era that abounded with them, most famous by a mile. And this is the man who tracked him to his home lair, Russell Welch, a criminal investigator for major crimes for the Arkansas State Police, whose no-nonsense investigation of smuggler Seal brought down upon him a ferocious and coordinated wrath that cost him his career, his health, and almost his life when he was sprayed in the face with military-grade anthrax, one of the deadliest viruses known on the planet.
Sheriff Fred Neblick, and I don't remember the date, I've got it in my notes, was walking past me one day behind the courthouse in Mena and stopped me and told me that he had information that Bob Dole had sent somebody to the Mena airport to look into the allegations that were being made at that time to see if it was going to have an impact on George Bush's upcoming bid for president.
And here's a place in our story that's almost a character in its own right. Legendary Mena, Arkansas, home of more rumors of Contra gun running and drug smuggling and covert black ops than any other spot on the face of the earth. There's an old saying in Hollywood about movie endings: Jaws ain't over till the sheriff meets the shark. And that's what we'll see on the historic runway, the first meeting of Lawman Welch and daring drug smuggler Billy Bob Bear Bottoms, a genuine Louisiana piece of work, as anyone with two nicknames can be assumed to be.
Well, what the Mena story means to me is, I have a term for it. I call it the Mena myth. But what Mena was to Barry Seal's operation was our transportation operation for the cartel was based out of Louisiana. And we would put our fixed-wing airplanes at Mena. We would have repairs or modifications made here, and plus it was a diversion.
Where does this mammoth industry hide? Picture hundreds of car plants. On a practical level, imagine having to hide every auto plant in the country, every factory and dealership. Can you imagine hiding 100 auto plants like this one? It's hard to conceive, isn't it? Guess what? Drugs are bigger.
So, how do you hide a $130 billion a year industry from a government that has cameras that can read the make of your golf ball from outer space? I don't think you can. Maybe we're being lied to. When we come back, I'll tell you why. Welcome back. So, are we being lied to about the American war on drugs? And if so, why? Well, the answer to the second question is easy. It would have to be, wouldn't it? Money. Lots and lots of easy, corrupting money. There have been reports for years and years that elements of our nation's covert intelligence have been financing their black operations, their secret operations, that is, through the sale of narcotics. But this brings up an almost unimaginable question. Could elements of our government be involved in the drug trade?
That's what we wanted to know. So first we applied our "Do pigs fly" test. I mean, if they flew, you'd have read about it in the literature, right? Bore News would have had big bold headlines: "Government test confirmed, pigs fly in Middale." And guess what? There is a ton of literature on your favorite bookstore shelves devoted to a scholarly subject called CIA drugs, detailing how and why national intelligence agencies like ours and others did a little bit more than just dabble in drugs. But the biggest impact might have been made here.
On January 20th, 1993, William Jefferson Clinton became the 42nd President of the United States. At the time, most Americans were not aware of the extent of Clinton's criminal background, nor were they aware of the media blackout, which kept this information from the public.
It's called, of course, the Clinton Chronicles, and it might just herald a whole new medium.
The hijacking of America was underway, and its impact on future generations would be incalculable.
Probably millions of people have seen a video that has gotten zero mention in the mainstream media, and hardly any on television. Many people first heard of the train deaths and its connection to Mena from it. As we say in Hollywood, the story's got legs.
In 1982, cocaine trafficker Barry Seal set up one of the largest drug smuggling operations in the United States in Mena, Arkansas, under the approving eye of Governor Bill Clinton.
Barry Seal had a bunch of planes and supposedly had pilots. Barry Seal was a drug smuggler. Now, he tried to set it up in his home state of Louisiana, but they wouldn't let him. He had to come to a state that had a sleazy governor.
Tonight, we've got startling new revelations that completely change our portrait of this man, Barry Seal. But first, note what's gone before. When Seal ran cocaine through Mena, Arkansas, Bill Clinton wasn't president of the United States or vice president. Running American foreign policy wasn't Governor Clinton's job. That job belonged to this man, George Bush, who also ran the Reagan administration's National Security Council, giving him a heady list of powerful functions. And while President Reagan reportedly often preferred Leave It to Beaver reruns over his daily 2 p.m. intelligence briefings, one guy who was apparently wide awake was Bush. Others in this story were and are household names: CIA Director William Casey. And of course, any discussion of drug smuggling in the 1980s is incomplete without a discussion of this man's role. Oliver North apparently had a real preoccupation with drugs in the 1980s. No, he wasn't using them, but there's been a lot of talk that he was selling them to fund the war in Nicaragua.
Even Gorbanifar knew that you were supporting the Contras.
Yes, he did. Izvestia knew it. The name had been in the papers in Moscow. It had been all over Danny Ortega's newscast. Radio Havana was broadcasting it. It was in every newspaper in the land.
All our enemies knew it, and you wanted to conceal it from the United States Congress.
We wanted to be able to deny a covert operation.
But if you listen to this woman, former head of a federally funded drug task force, ridiculing Oliver North may be letting him off too easy.
It wasn't until the time frame after Oliver North got involved in MENA that there was so much drug activity.
So listen as we tell you the train death story, and see if you can hear beneath it the secret heartbeat of America. The subjects of drug and covert intelligence take place in a murky arena filled with disinformation. Information on this level is superbly managed for plausible deniability. So we decided that if you wanted to find the truth about possible U.S. government corruption in drug smuggling in the 1980s, you would have to look around the periphery. You would have to look out of the corners of your eyes. So we're not looking for the smoking gun, but for the bent twigs, the people whose lives have been lost or changed, or whose careers have been ruined. This woman, Linda Ives, lost her son. She thinks our government was involved.
Another significant connection was made to the MENA drug smuggling operation when it was learned that witnesses had identified 2 police officers beating 2 boys fitting the description of Kevin and Don that night earlier at a little grocery store near the area where they were put on the train tracks. These 2 officers were identified as by witnesses as Kirk Lane and Jay Campbell, former Benton Police Department cops, then Pulaski County narcotics officers. One of those officers, Jay Campbell, is very good friends with Dan Lassiter, has known him since he was 13 years old.
And Dan Lassiter is?
Dan Lassiter is a convicted drug dealer, very good friends, financial supporter of Governor Bill Clinton.
So, is this a Clinton crazy story? Mrs. Ives is definitely not a fan.
Bill Clinton's connections are questionable, the company that he keeps, convicted drug dealers. I think that the evidence is overwhelming that Bill Clinton knew what was going on in Mena, Arkansas, and made no efforts to investigate or eradicate.
But I can't see anything here but a bereaved mother trying to make sense of the loss of a child.
You know, I guess I probably am amazed that my family could be swept up into anything of this magnitude. Certainly we were nobodies, and in the overall scheme of things, Kevin was nobody to anybody but us. Certainly, I don't believe Kevin was a threat to much of anybody. I don't think he would have particularly recognized officials, law enforcement officers, whoever was there. And I find it very, very difficult to understand the mentality that allows them to not only murder them viciously and brutally, but to sweep them under the rug like a piece of garbage.
The train deaths case is not just another famous unsolved mystery. It's got political ramifications of national significance because, and stop me if you've heard this one before, massive government cover-up of the deaths by state officials in Arkansas. But that's getting ahead of ourselves, a natural human tendency in a postmodern age. We all want to see the big picture at a glance, to reach down and feel for ourselves the dark glowing embers left behind by the firestorm called history. In the secret history of our life and times, how many nights are there like that humid Arkansas August midnight in 1987, where two unfortunate high school seniors looking for a little adventure got more than any teenager ever should bargain for?
In August 1987, my son Kevin had spent the night with his friend Don Henry, and Don's dad had allowed them to go out hunting after they arrived home. They left Don's home that night around 12:30 a.m. The next thing we knew, we'd been told that they'd been run over by a train.
More than once in our conversations with Mrs. Ives, we heard matter-of-fact testimony from her about events she has been forced to live through that verged on the surreal. I mean, how many parents have any expectation that their child will be killed by a train?
The explanation that the medical examiner had 3 weeks after the deaths was that they had smoked massive amounts of marijuana, had simply fallen asleep on the tracks and didn't hear the train coming. But one of the things that we did know was that they were lying in identical positions across the tracks, side by side, soldier style almost. If they were so stoned out of their minds, why were they lying in identical positions? We were also beginning to hear rumors about the appearance of the boy's blood and the fact that there was very little blood. A friend of mine's friend worked with the emergency medical team that was from Saline Memorial Hospital who responded to the scene that night, and she began telling us that they were saying that the appearance of the blood wasn't right, that the dark tar-like appearance of the blood indicated to them that the boys may have been dead for some time.
And then there was the tarp.
We also had begun hearing rumors of a tarp covering the boys. We questioned the authorities about it and were told that it was simply an optical illusion. My husband Larry has been a locomotive engineer for over 30 years, and certainly his experience was that 3 men in the cab of a train sitting in different positions didn't ordinarily see optical illusions.
Grief overcame doubt for the families at first.
You know, at that point in time, we didn't have any reason to believe anybody was lying to us or anything else, or that, you know, there was, anything there being covered up. We just had a lot of questions that they couldn't seem to answer, and we wanted a second opinion.
But the inconsistencies about the circumstances surrounding the boy's death kept nagging Linda.
It wasn't until sometime later that we actually talked directly to the crew. That crew, as a matter of fact, was very well known to my husband Larry and had worked with him for years. They basically told him that they were absolutely certain that they had seen a green tarp covering the boys, and were in fact able to describe it in detail, and also, as I said, they located the tarp after impact and showed it to one of the deputies.
Small towns in Arkansas are apparently not all like Andy Griffith's Mayberry.
There were suspicions immediately in the community. We were hearing things from Kevin's friends, things from people who knew somebody had been at the scene, and the very first thing that we heard that day when I was called to Don Henry's house was from Mr. Henry. He had been told by a local resident that they'd been shot and tied to the tracks and run over by a train. We were assured immediately by Saline County that that was not the case and that there was no indication of foul play. But that was the very first thing we were told. The rumors flew fast and furious, and it was a very short period of time when we began hearing things about drugs, drop sites and drops from trains.
And that's what makes this story different from any we had ever heard. Because as we sat there listening, we began to hear a tale that told of how in the 1980s drugs rained from the sky regularly onto the native soil of the sovereign state of Arkansas. When we come back, we'll hear the amazing story that changed Linda Ives' ideas about what is commonly referred to as our drug problem.
When a citizen and a parent like myself thinks of the drug problem in a community the size of Bryant, you think that that problem is with the kids. You never think that it's with law enforcement or with public officials.
It's a little cruel to say about somebody's personal tragedy, but the train death story seems made for television, and it's been retold on a dozen different shows, like this segment from Dateline. It's got all the ingredients of a really good movie of the week. You want heartrending? Get out your handkerchiefs.
It was just a hot August summer night. Kevin and Don had been out. They had not returned to Don's house. Something was wrong. I called his daddy and he said, "What is it?" I said, "I think he's dead."
But it's also a story of suspense and intrigue and a political potboiler to boot. The first big question most news magazine shows asked was this: what is this man, former Arkansas coroner Fahmy Malek, covering up?
Dr. Malek refused repeated requests to talk with us. But when we caught up with him, he said people didn't like him because he's from Egypt. And he claimed he had never made a single mistake in any of the 7,000 autopsies he conducted.
People say that as the state medical examiner, you were incompetent and you bungled cases, and that Governor Clinton, for some reason, defended you and protected you. Is that the case?
You have to understand that I did 7,000 autopsies. Not one single case overturned because of me.
Not a single case?
Not one single case.
But that's just not true.
About a week after the boys were killed, we were told that the crime lab had found traces of marijuana in their system and that the medical examiner was probably going to rule the death suicide. And we told the law enforcement officer that told us that we would never, ever accept a suicide ruling. And we learned in grand jury testimony later on that when the medical examiner, Fahmy Malek, called Jim Steed, our sheriff, and told him he was ruling double suicide, he told him, "You can't do that. The family will never accept suicide." And basically what they did was go along with an accidental ruling, and those traces of marijuana became massive amounts of marijuana.
Dateline's answer that Clinton was repaying a past favor from Malek was wrong, because now we've already got the sheriff lying too, and we're barely into round one.
We have learned that Saline County Sheriff's Office lied to us on a number of occasions. They lied about having tested for fibers of the tarp on the boys' clothing and told us that that was the basis of knowing that the tarp was an optical illusion, when in fact they had never tested their clothing.
10 years later, Malek is most interesting because he was so protected.
The medical examiner comes up and he has fabrication to where he has created his own evidence.
This is of a magnitude it could create a national scandal, and if necessary, it will.
I have work to do.
We began trying to obtain a second opinion on our own, basically. We ran into brick walls everywhere we turned. We got absolutely no cooperation whatsoever from local or state officials. Little Rock Crime Lab defied a court order to supply the things that we were requesting in order to get a second opinion. Saline Memorial Hospital also defied a court order. I called the State Attorney General's office and asked what recourse we had, and I was told that basically I had none, that as their legal counsel, they would strongly urge the Little Rock Crime Lab to comply with our court order, but if they didn't, there wasn't anything they could do about it.
I have work to do.
Excuse me, please. You can say that you are honest.
If I'm going to run a state any way I want to, having the coroner in my hip pocket is a good place to start. But couldn't they have picked one that wasn't so obviously a villain?
Read my lips. I'm not going to comment.
Eventually, there was a second autopsy. It showed some interesting results.
One of the things that we learned from the second autopsy was that Don Henry had been stabbed and Kevin was crushed in the face with the butt of a rifle, most likely. One of the very interesting things about Kevin's facial injury was that it was a pattern wound, and there was massive swelling and bruising around his eye, which was clear indication that that injury occurred before death. The weight of their lungs was nearly 3 times the weight that they should have been for a person their age, and were filled with blood, which was clear proof to the other pathologists who examined the case that the boys did not die with the impact of the train.
Things got real spooky real quick in this story, beginning with the first grand jury inquiry into the boys' deaths.
We learned during grand jury testimony that one of the officers in charge had actually ordered the scene be worked as an accident, despite the fact that one of the deputies there was asking for CID officers and was very suspicious immediately of the scene. One of the major bungles that they made was Chuck Talent, who was a criminal investigator, used the rear end of the train as a reference point in locating different evidence and things along the tracks. And of course, when the train left the scene, they had absolutely nothing. None of the evidence was handled properly. They literally fanned out about 4 deputies across and walked the point of impact to where the bodies were, and whatever they found they simply dumped in black garbage bags. Our local investigation was headed by our sheriff, Jim Steed. He later went on television bragging about what a thorough investigation he had conducted, and that he felt very sorry for us as parents, but that he had every confidence in Fahmy Malik's ruling. Their investigation was so thorough that they left my son's foot out there for 2 days in plain sight. It wasn't until sometime later that we actually talked directly to the crew. That crew, as a matter of fact, was very well known to my husband Larry, and had worked with him for years on that very same job. Well, they basically told him that they were absolutely certain that they had seen a green tarp covering the boys, and were in fact able to describe it in detail, and also, as I said, they located the tarp after impact and showed it to one of the deputies.
And this is where Dan Harmon enters our story. These Harmon news clips from Linda's documentary Obstruction of Justice give you the quick Classics Illustrated version to get you quickly up to speed in the sometimes Byzantine rituals pervading Arkansas politics.
Ironically, Dan Harmon and Richard Garrett, the very same men who had conducted the grand jury investigation of Kevin and Don's murders, were 2 of the main targets of Govar's drug and corruption investigation.
Here's the one-liner from the cliff notes to this case. 7 separate local, state, and federal investigations into the deaths have been stymied, probably because of Harmon.
Whatever comes out of it, if someone's charged or not charged, the grand jury has done a tremendous job.
Harmon led the initial grand jury proceedings in which the deaths got the name everyone that lived there already knew: murder, homicide. But that's as far as the government seemed prepared to go.
We certainly don't have any suspects at this point in time. It's been quite a while, and I really didn't anticipate that it would take this long when we first started.
Listen to the local press. Bless them. Don't they sound suspicious?
What about the murder? Is it connected at all with the grand jury investigation?
Not that we know of.
McCaskill was a witness in the Bryant train deaths investigation. Although police haven't ascertained a motive for the murder, they say there's no connection.
Link this investigation to the deaths of Don Henry or Kevin Ives, and I don't foresee anything in the pursuance of the rest of this investigation that would be anything that would make me change my mind.
And an embarrassing number of witnesses started turning up Clinton crazy dead. In Arkansas, you quickly learn that it's not true that the local people don't know what's going on. They know. Dan Harmon got indicted, and even in scandal-ridden Arkansas, this was and is big news today.
Accused of racketeering and drug offenses is a free man today. Harmon was released from federal custody yesterday while he awaits his trial. You may remember just last Thursday, Harmon was jailed after refusing to take drug tests. However, during a court hearing yesterday, he told a federal magistrate he would submit to those tests. Harmon maintains he's innocent and says he's a victim of government harassment.
Sir Dan Harmon got out of jail yesterday. A federal grand jury indicted Harmon on 11 counts. He ended up jailed after he refused a drug test, a condition of his freedom until trial.
Harmon went on trial to a buzz of anticipation because of who he is, what he knows, and perhaps most importantly, who he knows. Because if anyone is plugged in with the organized crime conspiracy that Clinton crazies seem to think runs Arkansas, it's him. So we show you the ultimate end to the saga of Dan Harmon in order to get you to understand just how long it's been since responsible authorities knew they had a Dan Harmon problem. So why does it take 10 years to figure it out? Maybe because it's not Dan Harmon's problem. His response to the indictment seemed curiously revealing.
If they can stick some garbage like this on me, then every American better be scared to death.
Here's a scene that'll tell you a lot about how seriously they still take the train death story in Little Rock and Dan Harmon's possible involvement. This security guard looks none too pleased at our presence on his sidewalk. I get the momentary feeling I'm in a gritty black and white 50s movie about gangland corruption, and I'm not real sure he's on our side. My mind is reeling from my interview with reporter Doug Thompson in the newsroom upstairs, whose fingerprints are all over the clips on the train death story after covering it for 7 years. Here's what's distracting me. The thought racing through my mind that the guy upstairs had just practiced what's called disinformation.
Was the investigation into the train deaths murder thwarted? Yes, it was. Whether out of sheer stupidity or clever cunning is still at issue. But according to Doug Thompson, the reporter at the Arkansas Democrat, who's covered this story for 7-8 years now, a real murder investigation became impossible once the sheriffs were done on the tracks where the boys died.
Thompson had told me Gene Duffy belongs in an insane asylum. Thompson told me that what he was proudest of in his years as a reporter was running Gene Duffy out of state. Now, former Secretary of the Treasury William Simon did say, if you thought massive government propaganda was the special providence of communist countries, think again. But we had just met Gene Duffy, as you are about to, and she'd struck us as anything but crazy. What do you think?
Well, the system kept me from prosecuting. We actually never got far enough to even issue any indictments, much less to the stage of prosecuting in court.
3 years after the train deaths, Gene Duffy was appointed to head a federally funded drug task force in Saline County. What happened to her will shock you. It shocked us.
The very day, the day that I was appointed to head the drug task force, I was sitting in my office in the prosecutor's office. Gary Arnold walked in, stood in front of my desk, and looked me straight in the eye and told me that I was not to use the drug task force to investigate any public officials. I didn't say anything to him. He turned around and walked out of the office.
Duffy was put in charge of a half-dozen undercover agents. At a certain point in every investigation, her agents bumped up on local government officials in the drug network's distribution chain of command.
When I had hired 7 undercover officers, and they went, of course, had to start street-level buying first, and they couldn't get much above street-level buying before they started connecting public officials to protecting drug dealers, to actually being involved in the drug dealing operation themselves. And the person whose name came up immediately and most frequently was Dan Harmon.
Then, one of her undercover agents dropped a bombshell.
About 3 months after the Drug Task Force was up and running, one of my undercover officers asked if he could open the train deaths case. The train deaths was described as Arkansas's most famous unsolved mystery. It had already aired on 2 separate filming episodes of Unsolved Mysteries. It had gotten national attention. There had at that point probably been 1,000 newspaper articles in Arkansas written about it. There were people who had been turning up dead who were possible witnesses.
This was the second time we'd heard of cocaine raining from the skies over Arkansas.
He said that there were drug drops, apparently, coming from airplanes in that area. And these drug drops from airplanes had virtually not been investigated by any of the law enforcement agencies in our district. And he thought that was something that our task force needed to look into. He said the drug drops were being made in the exact vicinity where Kevin and Don had been murdered. Scott determined that these low-flying airplanes were dropping packages. And we also developed an informant who was a confessed drug smuggler who told us that she had actually picked up a package of cocaine from that vicinity. So we've got people in that vicinity complaining about low-flying airplanes at night, maybe 6 months prior to when Kevin and Don were murdered. I found it very hard to believe that my undercover officer could see the obvious when the investigators prior to him couldn't see the obvious.
But the information went nowhere. Gene Duffy was the object of a smear campaign and what passes for a free press in Arkansas, and that was that.
My drug task force was shut down cold because we were getting too close. We were not allowed to get there.
Then rebellion set in briefly.
An undercover agent today badmouthed the drug task force and quit. He says there's too much dirt behind the scenes. Scott Llewellyn was a special agent for the drug task force. He quit today. He worked in the 7th Judicial District, which serves Saline, Grant, and Hot Spring counties. Llewellyn says that district is immersed in a reign of corruption that has important and powerful connections to political, judicial, and law enforcement officials. He says as an undercover officer, he gathered evidence of illegal activities, but says for some reason the drug task force chose to ignore him. Llewellyn says he quit because of the firing Friday of Gene Duffy, who was the drug task force administrator.
So in June of 1990, Dan Harmon became the district's prosecutor-elect. The first news conference or news interview that he gave, he used the entire interview to begin to discredit me.
Gene Duffy had been disposed of, forced to flee to Houston, Texas, in very real danger, where today she teaches geometry to high school kids. The answer as to why Dan Harmon had teamed up with a malleable reporter to conduct a smear campaign on a public official because she was performing too efficiently is jaw-dropping.
After working with the FBI for 18 months, beginning in March of 1995, of course now I realize what was the basis for Dan Harmon's viciousness against me and determination that I be not allowed to do my job. I now know that Dan Harmon was on the tracks with the boys the night that they were murdered.
Linda Ive states it coolly.
We learned that one witness has passed a polygraph placing the prosecuting attorney on the tracks the night Kevin and Don were killed. This is not just a case of local corruption, and that's what has made the battle so fierce, I suppose. You know, very early on we knew that there was local corruption in law enforcement and even public officials. And when the state police got involved, we were ecstatic because we thought that finally somebody was going to get to the bottom of what was going on in Saline County. And at that point in time, we thought it was simply Saline County. And then it became very clear that the state police were not doing their job and were not going to do their job. There was a 1990 federal investigation, and we were in fact promised indictments out of that 1990 federal grand jury investigation. And suddenly, when Chuck Banks shut that investigation down in June of '91, without prior warning, we were devastated, simply because it made it an entirely different animal almost, because who has the power to shut down a federal investigation?
Good question. We wondered, who does have the power to shut down a federal investigation? Could the deaths of 2 hapless high school seniors on an August night in rural Arkansas have anything to do with matters pertaining to our country's national security? National security is a subject that turns up in the weirdest places, like here. This is the British 60 Minutes, a show called The Big Story.
Tonight's big story, the trail of drug smuggling and gun running that leads to the door of the White House.
And their take on the train desk tale looks a lot like the ones we've already seen. They open on a silent train bed. They retell the Fahmy Malak story and the blundering cover-up of government officials over a span of 7 investigations and long, frustrating years. So what's unusual about this show, except for the funny accents? This. It was banned in the USA. That's right, within hours of its release in the United States, the show's distributor was forced to pull it off the shelves. Want to know why? Listen closely.
Linda refused to accept the official version of Kevin's death and set out to uncover the truth. She found that her son had been the victim of a web of conspiracy which could be traced back to a remote airport called Mina. What happened there could threaten Bill Clinton more than the personal scandals and financial slurs which have dogged his time at the White House.
They said the M word, and that's a big no-no. They mentioned Mina.
The secret history of our life and times was, and still is, written at places like here. This is officially the Intermountain Regional Airport, better known as Mina, a small, obscure town in western Arkansas through which was woven the threads of virtually every secret government black operation of the 1980s. If you're talking Oliver North, the CIA, Contras, and cocaine, you're talking Mina.
The mere mention of Mina has been sending shivers down the spines of federal government propaganda officials for 2 administrations now. Which is good because it's nice to see Democrats and Republicans working together for a change. Mina has become a symbol of how our 2 parties can work together in America. It's a truly bipartisan cover-up. What are they covering up? Whatever it is must be pretty big, because it's got some people killed, like, to pick just one example, the head of then-Governor Bill Clinton's security detail, Jerry Parks, was killed in a hail of gunfire after telling associates he was a dead man 1 month after Vince Foster died. Some inquisitive souls, like Arkansas State criminal investigator Russell Welch, only got sprayed with anthrax. You're tempted to tell him he got off easy.
She came home and took me to another doctor. She had to help me to the car. Took me to another doctor who was a Vietnam veteran in town, who, when he saw me, immediately called the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta. When I got there, there was a team at St. Edward's Mercy Hospital in Fort Smith waiting for me. They were in touch with the Center for Disease Control. The next day, the doctor, she asked me if my job was, how much danger was involved with my job, and I told her that danger was pretty much inherent with a job, that I was a cop and generally handled major cases. And she said, well, we think that you've been poisoned with anthrax. She said, we don't have time to test for it. We're going to treat you for it. She said, somebody did this to you. Said somebody sprayed this to you. Described how anthrax, for the purpose of assassination, is carried in spray canisters.
Russell Welch spent much of his career as a criminal investigator skulking around this airport, and his is acknowledged to be the most complete and trustworthy account of what went on here.
A criminal investigator for the Arkansas State Police was stationed in Mena originally in 1979 because of allegations of narcotics activity at the airport. And then there were smugglers here before Barry Seal. And I was pressured by the state police to monitor airplane traffic, develop sources of information, monitor whatever methods possible, fuel pumps, in numbers, to determine what kind of drug traffic may be present out there. And the airport itself is not unique to drug traffic. I think there's drug traffic everywhere. I think any airport could have a lot of it. My concern was this one. It was the one that I was assigned to, and it was the one that I was given responsibility to keep up with.
It's almost like they say about the nightclub in that movie Casablanca.
Everybody comes to Rick's.
Everybody comes to Mena. And that's kind of weird all by itself, because look at it. It's a pretty small town. It's located in Pleasant Hills and forested low mountains, and they're all tucked in one of the hardest to get places in the lower 48 contiguous states. Maybe that's the secret of its popularity. But Aspen it ain't. So what was everybody coming here to do? Bill Clinton was at Mena, which itself isn't sinister. He was the governor of this state. The CIA was at Mena. They finally got tired of years and years of denials and admitting running special ops out of here once. Right.
Another case I tried to open about the same time, not long before that, involved a person who it turns out now is well placed in CIA, had worked with Southern Air Transport in Miami, lives in El Dorado, Arkansas, was a friend of a very good friend of Buzz Sawyer, who was killed on the C-123. He had 2 smuggling aircraft at the Mena airport. I was ordered not to open an investigation on those smuggling aircraft. These are direct orders from the state police, no explanation.
Historic cocaine buccaneer Barry Seal made these runways his home, and it's no wonder.
If you look at a map, the location seems pretty nice for a trip from South America. And it is small. It's a lit airport, there's not a tower on it, so it's not monitored, so it's an ideal spot for a smuggler to be able to find at nighttime without having to worry about being recorded every time they come in and leave.
While Barry was bringing in up to $5 billion worth of cocaine into the United States of America during the 1980s, this is where he based his cargo airline.
And at that time I thought, because Barry Seal was already saying that he was involved with the CIA, and there was reason to think that there was CIA activity because of the C-123 and the knowledge that was made available then that the C-123 had made a trip to Nicaragua, that possibly Barry Seal was in fact working with the CIA somehow. And I thought I'd be able to develop that and close my case and get on with the rest of my career investigating murders, robberies, and rapes.
Everybody comes to Mena. The Barry Seal story is the secret history of the 1980s. His life and violent death were bracketed by 2 very public events. In the first, he piloted a C-123 military cargo aircraft to Nicaragua in a drug sting that was designed to be the Gulf of Tonkin incident of a U.S.-Nicaragua war.
I know every American parent concerned about the drug problem will be outraged to learn that top Nicaraguan government officials are deeply involved in drug trafficking.
This photograph, taken from the back of Barry Seal's plane, purports to show a Sandinista official, Federico Vaughn, loading cocaine onto Barry Seal's plane. In fact, Federico Vaughn worked for Oliver North. But it's this event for which Barry Seal will be remembered longest. In this, his beloved C-123 Fat Lady airplane was brought down by Sandinistas over Nicaragua with Eugene Hasenfuss on board.
Good evening. There's a furious debate going on tonight between the governments of the United States and Nicaragua, and it revolves on the question, whose cargo plane carrying ammunition to the anti-government countries was shot down inside Nicaragua yesterday? And who were the Americans on board working for? They'd apparently flown from El Salvador. The government of Nicaragua says it is proof of direct U.S. involvement in the war. The Reagan administration says not true. Our first report is from Nicaragua, and here's ABC's Peter Collins.
The Sandinistas say the aircraft that went down was a Korean War vintage C-123. Informed sources close to the Contras confirm this and say they have been using the aircraft to drop ammunition and supplies by parachute to their men. It crashed in remote, swampy terrain deep inside Nicaragua that can be reached only by Sandinista Air Force helicopters. The Sandinistas claim 4 Americans were aboard the plane. They say 3 were killed and 1 survived. He is identified as Eugene Hassenfuss, a Marine Corps veteran from Marinette, Wisconsin. The Sandinistas quote him as saying he was an American advisor based in El Salvador.